Before the coup, Myanmar experienced a fragile but meaningful period of democratic life. Under the civilian administration led by Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and President U Win Myint, people began to experience freedoms unknown for decades. Citizens voted in elections, civil society groups emerged, public debate became visible. Democracy was imperfect, but it was real. For many people, it was the first time they felt respected as citizens, not subjects. That experience made the loss even more painful. The coup was not only against leaders. It was against the people themselves. The public response was immediate and unprecedented. Millions of citizens refused to cooperate with the military regime. This nationwide resistance became known as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM. Doctors left hospitals. Teachers left classrooms, bank workers, railway staff, engineers, and civil servants refused to work under military rule. One nurse recalled,
"If I continued working under the junta, I would be betraying my people. I chose dignity over safety."
Participation in CDM meant losing jobs, facing arrest, and risking life. Yet people continued. The message was clear: the military could seize power, but not legitimacy. The military opened fire on peaceful civilians, deliberately using lethal force in the streets and destroying residential areas nationwide. Security forces carried out mass arrests, night raids, and arbitrary detentions. Beyond physical violence, the military systematically abused human dignity. People were silenced, their rights were denied, and they were treated not as citizens, but as enemies of the state. As violence intensified and dignity was repeatedly violated, many people came to believe that peaceful resistance alone was no longer enough. As repression intensified, many citizens realized that peaceful protest alone could no longer protect their communities. Local self-defense groups began to form. Students, farmers, workers, and professionals joined together. These groups later became known as the People's Defence Forces, PDF. They were not born from ambition, but from necessity. For many, joining the resistance was not a political choice. It was a decision to protect families, villages, and dignity. The struggle entered a new phase. In the early stages, resistance operations were limited and defensive. PDF units focused on protecting villages, ambushing military patrols, and disrupting supply routes. These actions were decentralized and locally organized. Over time, coordination improved. PDF units began cooperating with ethnic resistance organizations. From scattered resistance, a nationwide network began to emerge. As resistance capacity expanded, revolutionary forces began targeting towns. Towns were symbols of military control, centers of administration, policing, and logistics. Resistance forces isolated towns by cutting supply routes and surrounding military outposts. Fighting often lasted days or weeks. Eventually, military units were forced to withdraw from police stations, administrative offices, and fortified camps. When towns fell, junta control collapsed. Town capture battles marked a turning point. They proved that the military's control was not absolute. Throughout the conflict, civilians remained at the center. They were not only victims, they were participants in survival. Families rebuilt schools underground, communities created informal healthcare systems. One teacher said, "Even in war, we cannot stop educating our children. If we lose knowledge, we lose our future." Resistance was not only military, it was social, cultural, and moral. The military launched ground offensives to suppress People's Defense Forces, burning villages and destroying thousands of civilian homes. Entire communities were forced to flee as fire and violence spread across rural and urban areas. As its ground operations weakened, the military increasingly relied on airstrikes. Bombs were dropped on towns and villages, killing civilians and destroying homes. Hospitals, schools, and religious buildings were also targeted, turning places of safety into zones of fear. During the capture of towns, civilians were trapped in the middle of the fighting, families hid in their homes or fled into forests with nothing but fear and uncertainty. Beyond physical destruction, the violence deeply affected human dignity. Ordinary citizens saw their lives, communities, and hope shattered. What began as political conflict became a nationwide human tragedy. Throughout the conflict, the country's elected leaders remained imprisoned. Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and President U Win Myint became symbols of the stolen democratic mandate. Their detention reminded people that the coup was not temporary. It was a systematic attempt to erase civilian authority. Yet their absence did not weaken resistance. Instead, it strengthened the belief that the struggle was larger than individuals. It was about the nation's future. Five years after the coup, the struggle continues. The people of Myanmar did not choose war. They chose dignity. When dignity was denied, resistance became inevitable. When resistance forces first took up arms, they lacked weapons and resources. They endured brutal attacks and heavy losses. The people did not surrender. They rose again, fought relentlessly, and captured towns. Driven by an unyielding desire for dignity, they refused to live in fear or silence. Their struggle was a fight for freedom, for respect, and for the future they deserve. This documentary has recorded the courage, resilience, and determination of the people of Myanmar. In recognition of their struggle and sacrifice, this record is presented by the Department of Strategic Studies and Records for the People's Defense Forces, DSSPDF. The conflict is not yet over, but neither is the will of the people. On February 1st, 2021, the people of Myanmar awoke to a devastating reality. Their voices had been silenced. They had chosen their leaders through democratic elections. They had believed that their votes represented their future. But in a single morning, their choice was erased. The military seized power and detained elected leaders. For millions, it was more than a political crisis. It was a betrayal of dignity. People felt abused, not because they had failed, but because their democratic will had been denied. Soon, the streets changed. Peaceful protesters were confronted by armed soldiers. Voices demanding justice were met with gunfire. Faced with this reality, large numbers of citizens refused to remain passive. What began as peaceful protest gradually evolved into a broad movement of resistance. This documentary examines 5 years of conflict and transformation in Myanmar, how people responded to the collapse of democratic governance, how violence reshaped society, and how the struggle for dignity and representation continues. In the early hours of February 1, 2021, while most of the country was still asleep, the military launched a coordinated operation against Myanmar's civilian leaderships. Before dawn, communication networks in major cities began to fail. Internet access was disrupted, telephone lines became unstable. Military units surrounded government buildings and strategic locations. At her residence in Napier Daw, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, the state councillor and leader of the civilian government, was placed under detention. She was taken away without public explanation, without legal process, and without the consent of the people who had elected her. Nearby, President U Win Myint, the head of state, was also detained. He was removed from office by force, along with members of parliament and senior officials of the National League for Democracy. Within hours, the military announced that it had assumed power under a state of emergency. For the people of Myanmar, the arrests were shocking. These leaders were not only political figures, they symbolized the people's democratic choice. As news spread, anger and disbelief filled the streets. People realized that their votes had been ignored, their voices dismissed, and their future seized by force. The arrest of Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and President U Win Myint marked the beginning of a new era, an era in which power replaced law and fear replaced democratic dialogue. But it also marked the beginning of resistance.